I never thought the day would come where I did a video on a movie in the MCU, let alone have it be Iron Man 3, but here we are. To be honest, I was planning on doing a video on Zack Snyder's Man of Steel from 2013, but I decided to take to my Instagram platform where I asked you guys which one you would rather watch, Man of Steel or Iron Man 3. And you guys voted for Iron Man 3, so here we are. Iron Man 3 was the first MCU movie released following the Avengers in 2012, and this movie in general already had a lot of pressure to be something great, something that could continue this story, which at the time only had 6 installments. Jon Favreau, the director of the first 2 Iron Man films, had stepped down from directing as he had begun development on a film called The Magic Kingdom. And if you're wondering if you've ever seen this movie, the answer is no. The Magic Kingdom was a film that was never completed, and as far as I know, never even got cameras rolling. The movie was described as Night at the Museum, but taking place at somewhere like Disney World. I mean, the title of the movie is called The Magic Kingdom, so I would assume it's about Disney. Either way, the premise of the film is a fairly easy concept to grasp, but for some reason never got made. It was reported that Jon Favreau was not happy with the screenplay and ended up just leaving the project, leaving the third Iron Man film to be directed by none other than Shane Black. Right from the start, this is a movie that feels like there was a lot of wasted potential on so many levels. It feels like this movie had so many great ideas that were just crammed in here and then changed or altered in one form or another by some studio executive that wanted to make sure that this movie did not fail. For the most part, it succeeded in that aspect because the film had almost recouped its entire budget of $200 million on its opening weekend, grossing over $1 billion worldwide. So it's safe to say that commercially this film was a success, but that's not my point. Iron Man 3 is a weird movie for me because on one hand there are some aspects of this film that I really like, and then on the other hand there are some aspects of this film that I really dislike. And I mean that in the most condescending way possible. To put it plainly, I think this film is a fucking mess. So, let's get into it. The first thing I want to talk about is this emotional conflict that Tony is suffering with for a good majority of the movie. He has a lot of anxiety and PTSD due to the events that happened in the Avengers, which makes sense. He risked his life at one point not knowing if he would ever come back, and he's ultimately the reason the Avengers won that battle in the first place. I myself personally deal with anxiety on a daily basis, and I barely even own a car. So, he's dealing with this emotional conflict, and that emotional conflict could potentially set up a number of scenes that could lead to the climax of this film. For example, maybe Tony could find a way to practice handling his anxiety, and throughout the film he has to learn to ride these episodes out, leading up to the final conflict where he is fighting the Mandarin. Tony would then start to experience one of these episodes and overcome it to save Pepper, or Rhodey, or literally anybody he would need to. But no, this film sets up this emotional conflict within Tony just to abandon it halfway through the movie. What really bothers me about this though isn't that it is just a half-baked idea that never delivered, but that the first 2 acts of the film are so insistent that you go on this journey with Tony as he suffers from this, making a statement that being a hero can take a toll on the life of a human being, but just subtly leaving it behind because there are bigger matters at hand, which would honestly be the best time to bring this idea into play. There's so many great ways that this film sets up these emotional beats. For example, there's a scene in the first act that I think ultimately uses this plot point very effectively. Tony is sleeping and accidentally summons one of the Iron Man suits to his room because of a nightmare he's having regarding the events of the Avengers. This scene serves 2 purposes. It shows us that Tony is having trouble dealing with these events in his past. He's anxious and struggling mentally. It puts us as an audience on his side. He may be a hero, but he's still human. The second purpose is that he is setting up a conflict that will be present throughout the remainder of the film's runtime. Only it doesn't. And there are so many instances in this film where this continues to happen, which brings me to my next point. The villains. Now, this is where I will give this film a little more leniency because technically this conflict doesn't just disappear, but is just reassigned. Iron Man 3 was marketed to look like Ben Kingsley was the main antagonist, but if you've seen this movie, you know that that is not the case. Ben Kingsley plays a character named Trevor Slattery, who is an actor standing in for the real Mandarin.
He's here, but he's not here. He's here, but he's not here.
What do you mean?
It's complicated. Hey, it's complicated, right?
is.
It's complicated.
The real Mandarin ends up being Aldrich Killian, played by the wonderful Guy Pearce. And there's a whole lot that actually goes into this whole villain situation, but I'm going to just stick with what ended up making it to the theatrical cut. Now, in theory, this little switcheroo that is pulled on the audience really isn't a bad idea. Giving us all this marketing and promotional content that shows Ben Kingsley as this menacing villain, only to pull the rug out from under us, would have been a great idea if the movie didn't play it off like a fucking SpongeBob episode. By the time that the real Mandarin is revealed at the end of the film, it is incredibly underwhelming. The only real fun there is at that point is the CGI fest of different Iron Man suits flying around, and discussing which ones looked cool with your friends. But what if I told you that this film originally had a different villain? Maya Hansen, played by Rebecca Hall, was originally the main antagonist of this film, and if you pay really close attention during the first act, it's very easy to pick up on this. The idea for what is the main conflict of this film is introduced by her in the opening scene of the movie, and is sort of sprinkled throughout the film as little bits and pieces that were changed to fit her in as just another person working for Aldrich Killian. Now, I can't really call this idea half-baked because as far as I know, this change was made before the film had started shooting, but the reasoning behind this is what I find interesting. Ike Perlmutter, a chairman and former CEO of Marvel Entertainment, decided that Iron Man 3 should have a male villain because he was afraid that toys of a female villain would not sell. Which is a shame because so much of her character in this movie could have made for such a good antagonist. So much of Maya Hansen's character is what would have made a good antagonist for Tony in this movie. They're both characters who struggle to find a balance of good or bad, and they're really just trying to make this world a better place, even if they aren't in a conventional manner. Tony has a suit that may as well be a weapon of mass destruction, and Maya has this formula that basically gives us the chance to start limb regeneration, with the exception that it could possibly kill you. Ultimately, that makes this film feel a lot more personal, and like Tony would be going up against somebody who he used to be. It also just kind of astounds me how many big decisions in the MCU have been made solely on the basis of toy sales. Before the MCU was a thing, there was one big decision that had to be made, which was what movie would kick off this franchise. And then a few years later, we got the first Iron Man film. But believe it or not, that decision was also made based on which toys would sell better. And eventually they came to the conclusion that Iron Man would be the first installment made in the cinematic universe, which was probably the best thing that could have been done for this franchise. Unfortunately, the toy sales factor only seemed to work for this one movie. The last thing that I really wanted to discuss with this film in particular is the tonal shift that it has and how it affected the MCU going forward. What I loved about the first two Iron Man films is that at their core they were genuinely good movies with funny moments scattered throughout the film. Iron Man 3 is trying to be inherently funny throughout its entire runtime, and it's incredibly distracting.
You walked right into this one. I've dated hotter chicks than you.
As if that's not bad enough, it seems like after that, every film in the MCU following Iron Man 3 just keeps doing this. I think one of the best comic book adaptations ever put to screen is Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2. While the film has been slightly dated, I still find this film to be incredibly effective and is able to give us everything that we need in a good superhero film. The reasoning behind this is that, at its core, the film is about Peter. Spider-Man 2 is a film about Peter before it is about Spider-Man, the same way that Iron Man is about Tony before it is about the suit. Tonally, the first two Iron Man films are pretty consistent, but Iron Man 3 is too focused on giving the audience a fun time that anything with substance, like the anxiety subplot, is abandoned. And it doesn't stop there. Some of the best films that are in the Marvel Cinematic Universe work because as an audience we are able to empathize with them. So while we may be able to enjoy these films and have a good laugh with them, we're losing a lot of great character moments and emotional connections because they'd rather distract us. I mentioned Spider-Man 2 earlier and how well that movie works, and I can't help but think of that scene where Peter tells Aunt May that he blames himself for Uncle Ben's death, where he proceeds to explain what happened, and it keeps me wondering when we will ever get a scene like this in the franchise. Now, I understand that comedy is something that could be a tool for some films in the MCU. A film like Ant-Man benefits from the comedy because people are already kind of laughing at the idea of there being an Ant-Man, so we may as well capitalize on that idea. Regardless of whatever change has been made, I do believe that there is an over-reliance on comedy in the MCU. And while there are a lot of emotional arcs in the MCU, you don't really notice that they're there until you rewatch them and notice that the comedy is just a huge distraction for everything else that the film has. Whatever the actual case may be doesn't matter. I do believe that there is an over-reliance of comedy in the MCU, but I do hope that is toned down a little bit for some of their future movies. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe down below. Comment what your favorite MCU film is. I'd love to hear from you guys, and I'll see you in the next video.